Today, I'm going to talk about the story of Twitter, one of the most recognizable and influential social networks on the planet. Some say it's informative, some say toxic, but regardless, the microblogging platform has grown and developed over the past 15 years to capture the attention of hundreds of millions of people. It's become a tool that enables communication, sharing and breaking news, expressing opinions, with over 206 million monetizable daily active users and a market cap of $52 billion. Their evolution has not been linear. It's been described as a story of power, money, friendship, and betrayal. This story is part of a series that I'm doing on consumer technologies where I dive deep into the founders' backgrounds, idea inception, how the company grew from where it started to where it is now. If you enjoy it, please feel free to like, subscribe, comment, and let me know what you'd like to see next. Quick disclaimer, as usual, all the information that is in this video is publicly available online and I've tried to objectively piece it together, although a 15+ year story is very difficult to make into one short video. The story is also really messy, so please let me know if you feel that I've misquoted something or if I've missed something out that's extremely significant. Put it down in the comments. The best place to start is with the founders' backgrounds. There are 4 founders that are generally acknowledged as being there right at the beginning of Twitter, and I'm going to talk about them. So that's Noah Glass, Evan Williams, Jack Patrick Dorsey, and Christopher Isaac Stone. I'm going to start with Noah. First of all, the internet seems very confused between 2 different Noah Glasses. I personally don't think they look alike, but it's probably because they have the same name and are both technology entrepreneurs from the US. Noah was born in Santa Cruz, Northern California in the early 70s, and he lived in a small house next to a barn in a decrepit area that was home to a hippie commune. Shortly after Noah was born, his dad left the house and never came back. His mother would make trinkets and candles by hand so that she could sell in order to pay their bills. Noah moved away from the commune to live with his grandparents who lived nearby, and one of his relatives took the role of a father figure and guided him until he became an adult. Growing up, Noah's mind moved in a very hectic way. They didn't know if it was ADD, ADHD, OCD, or maybe a mix of all 3, but he had always been like that. One day in his late teens, he was acting erratically and the police picked him up. They didn't know if he was on mushrooms or methamphetamines. He told them he only had a few cups of coffee, but they arrested him, tested him for drugs, and kept him in a jail cell overnight. The next day, he was still acting the same and they saw that he hadn't tested positive for any drugs, and so they let him go. He went to university and then dropped out and worked for a place called Industrial Lights Magic, and then he quit. After that, at some point, he worked on a few projects with Mark Cantor, the founder of Macromind, which later became Macromedia, the birthplace of Shockwave, and later Flash Animation and multimedia software. He's been married twice. The first time he was married, he got divorced in 2003, and then he got married again to his wife called Erin, who was a law student. And in the early 2000s, Noah created a project where users would dial a number and the servers would turn your voice message into an MP3 message hosted on the internet. There isn't that much information about Noah's upbringing online, and I think you'll come to understand a bit more about why later on. For now, I'm going to move on to Evan Williams. Evan, also known as Ev, was born on the 31st of March 1972 in Nebraska. He grew up with 2 older siblings and his parents in a farm in a town called Clarkson that had less than 500 residents. Ev was a daydreamer and different to other Midwestern boys who learned to fire rifles, hunt deers, and love football. He would spend hours alone with his thoughts. He liked making plastic models in his room, taking his bike apart, then putting it back together, and drawing video game ideas because he didn't have a computer. When he grew up and learned to drive, his first car was a yellow BMW. This made him really popular in school and people liked to hang out with him and invite him to parties. During his senior year of school, his parents got divorced and a lot of people were gossiping about them in their town, so they moved to a different town and he moved to a different school, but then he felt lonely again at school. He was always coming up with these business schemes, and when the internet started getting popular, he made a VHS tape explaining what it was, and he spent one summer trying to convince local businessmen to buy them, but he didn't sell that many in the end. He went to the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and joined the farmhouse fraternity before dropping out after a year and a half because he thought it was a waste of time. At the age of 25 and at the height of the tech boom, Ev packed his stuff and moved to California. He moved to a place called Sebastopol, a small quiet hippie town, for a job at a technology publishing company called O'Reilly Media that paid him $48,500 a year. At the time, he was in thousands of dollars of student loan and credit card debt, so he moved into a tiny room above a stranger's garage that cost $600 a month. He was hired to write marketing material at O'Reilly, but his personality really started rubbing people up the wrong way. Once he was asked to compose the marketing material for the company's latest product, he responded by writing an email to the entire company saying that he wouldn't write it because the product was a piece of shit. As a side thing, he started a website called evhead.com where he would share his personal thoughts and experiences. He also taught himself how to code on the side and was able to do this with O'Reilly's published technology how-to books. Soon he became an independent contractor and he moved to Palo Alto for freelancing opportunities and ended up working for companies like Intel and Hewlett-Packard. He made more friends in the industry there and started going to parties. It was so expensive, so he moved into an apartment in the Mission area. Ev met a girl called Meg Hourihan, also a programmer, and they started dating. Their relationship didn't last, but they decided to start a company together together with a group of friends. It was a software to increase productivity in the workplace. They called it Pyro Labs and worked out of Ev's apartment. As a side project in the company, Ev and another employee built this simple internal diary system that was a website to keep employees updated on work progress, but Meg didn't like it. In the summer of '99, Ev released this self-publishing website and called it Blogger. He actually coined the term blogger and was really key in the popularization of the word blog. He wanted Blogger to let people who couldn't code create a web blog or blog, and had a vision for everyone to have their own blog similar to an online newspaper. As Blogger became popular, Meg started to see its potential but didn't think that Ev could run a business. There were arguments and the team disbanded, so Ev was left running the company alone in his living room. He continued writing his blog evhead.com and at the same time was spending 14 to 16 hours a day coding for Blogger and making new features. Blogger started getting quite toxic and was getting an overwhelmingly negative response from the offensive topics that people would post on there, and since he couldn't police it, he decided not to. He had a motto or moral code which was push button publishing for the people. This is what helped it explode. Blogger eventually made enough money through ads and donations for Ev to hire a few engineers, and at the same time as Blogger grew, so did Ev's popularity in the area. Next, I'm going to talk about Jack Dorsey, who is probably the most famous of the 4 Twitter co-founders. Jack was born on the 19th of November 1976 in St. Louis, Missouri. He grew up with his parents and his 2 brothers, Daniel and Andrew. His dad, Tim Dorsey, worked in a company that manufactures mass spectrometers, and his mother, Marcia Dorsey, was a homemaker. Jack was born with a speech impediment which made it difficult for him to speak as a child. He could only pronounce words with 1 syllable and was eventually able to overcome this through therapy, but it really affected his confidence and made him quite shy as a kid. At the age of 8, Jack's family got a computer, the IBM PC Junior. He fell in love with it and started to learn how to code. He helped his dad on work-related projects and generally spent a lot of time on the computer. As a kid, Jack enjoyed riding buses and he was really fascinated by the structure and system of transportation, and he would also occasionally be a child fashion model. On weekends, his mum Marcia would drag him and his brothers shopping to look for what she called the one true bag, and he started developing an interest in bags himself. As a teenager, Jack created an open source taxi dispatching software, and eventually this was adopted by taxi cab companies. In 1995, Jack enrolled at the University of Missouri Rolla and attended for 2 years before transferring to New York University in 1997. He then dropped out of NYU after 2 years and was 1 semester short of graduating. He got a job in New York by breaking into a company's website to show them how vulnerable it was, and then they hired him, but he also explored quite a few different career paths. For example, he worked for a bicycle messenger company and at one point was a massage therapist. Around 1999, Jack moved to San Francisco and started a company with his friend. The company was used to handle the dispatching of couriers and emergency vehicles as well as taxis. Jack was an anarchist and had been vociferous online for years. He had built a personal website called gu.st where he posted rants about capitalism, and he would share his contempt for war and corporations. He had a nose ring and he loved it, but at one point his employer told him not to wear it at work, and instead he wore a plaster on top of it which restricted his breathing and meant he was only breathing through his mouth, but he reasoned that this was the way to stand up for his rights. He got a freelance job at Alcatraz where he would write software that was used to sell tickets to tourists visiting. Jack also liked to conduct these experiments every once in a while. In 2002, he was fascinated by eBay, and so he didn't have anything to sell, but he decided to put himself up for auction. He offered to read Goodnight Moon, the famous children's book, over the phone to the highest bidder, and he managed to sell to 4 different people who paid $100 to listen to him read it. And finally, the 4th founder is Christopher Isaac Stone, also known as Biz Stone. Biz was born on the 10th of March 1974 in Boston, Massachusetts. He grew up in Wellesley, which was an affluent suburb of Boston. His neighbors were often wealthy and the median income of their town was well into the 6 figures. Biz's family, however, was raised on food stamps and welfare. Biz's mother was adopted by a kind Swiss couple as a child and they passed away, but they left their large house to his mother and her children. As Biz grew up, his father, who was a Boston car mechanic, wasn't really around. He would occasionally visit them in a drunken rage and was violent with his mum, and he ended up in hospital a few times. Biz's mother kicked his dad out the house, and eventually Biz and his siblings were only allowed to see him on Sundays. When Biz turned 16, he decided to stop these weekly visits. As a single mother, Biz's mum decided to sell the big house to get a smaller place in order to let her children attend the county's good schools and pay their bills, and she ended up selling and downgrading again after 4 years. Although his childhood was turbulent, he became a very charming person that used jokes and humour to make his mum and sisters laugh and feel better. He really hated confrontation but saw good in many bad situations. As a kid, Biz would visit his family friend on the weekend, and he happened to be an electrician, so he spent hours building things with him. He built a doormat that was a doorbell when someone stepped on it at the front door, and he also attempted to build a scuba gear out of coke and rubber tubes, which failed. Biz spent a lot of time with his best friend from the 3rd grade called Mark Ginsberg. Mark's family was wealthy and owned an Apple II computer, so Biz spent hours and days at Mark's house playing video games and drawing on built-in graphics programs. After high school, Biz attended Northwestern University for a year, and then he went to University of Massachusetts also for a year, but he didn't graduate from either of them. He worked as a designer at the publisher Little Brown & Co. Between 1999 to 2001, Biz was the creative director of a company called Sanga. This was a blog community that he helped form. His co-workers started taking the company in a direction that Biz thought was unethical, so instead of confronting them, he chose to quit. Next, on to how they all met, starting with Ev and Noah, who had met first. So Noah was in his apartment one day reading Fortune magazine, and there was a picture of Ev in the feature that had been written about him on Blogger. Noah recognized him because Ev was his neighbor. He ran over to his kitchen door, opened it, and shouted, "Hey blogger," and Ev walked out of his balcony. He then asked him if he was Evan Williams because he saw the magazine article, and Ev said yeah. Noah introduced himself and they started talking from there. Their friendship grew from chatting on the porch to coffees, lunch and parties. Noah also became friends with Jason Goldman, an early employee at Blogger, and they all hang out together. Ev was very reserved and standoffish, but he warmed to Noah's bubbly personality really quickly. They were polar opposites, but they started getting along really well. At the end of 2002, Blogger moved out of a rented office and temporarily back into Ev's apartment. Noah had been working from home for a couple of years at this point, and he wanted someone to share his ideas with since his wife was often at law school. So he would rock up to their house and help them if they needed any and just go for a chat and whatever. And he wasn't shy about doing this. He saw the team working on Blogger and he really wanted to be a part of something like that. At this point, Blogger had grown to 1 million weblogs and 200,000 active users. Their friendship was mainly Ev doing most of the listening and Noah doing most of the talking, but they grew close, and one day Ev pulled Noah to the side and said to him, "There's something that I want to tell you, it's a secret, and I'd appreciate if you don't tell anyone." He then explained to him that Google approached him to buy Blogger and he wasn't sure what to do about it. Noah was really excited for him. At that point, Ev barely had enough money to eat or pay his rent, and so he decided to sell. Noah watched him go through with the deal, which took about 4 months to finalize, and on the 15th of February 2003, the deal went through and tens of millions of dollars were transferred to Ev's account. This acquisition made him a tech celeb. A lot of people wanted to speak to him and he was featured on news and articles and blogs. The Blogger team then moved to Google campus where there was unlimited food and coffee, and they no longer had to worry about money. They were just focused on trying to adapt to this new giant company, which was really different from what they all had known. In the summer of 2003, Biz had read a lot about what Ev was doing with Blogger, and at this point he had been at Google for a few months. He decided to email him saying that he was a missing member of the band. Ev responded after a few phone interviews. He decided that they wanted to hire him. They shared jokes and spoke about the ethics of blogging on these interviews. Google didn't really understand why Ev wanted to hire him since he was a university dropout and had no programming experience, but in the end he managed to convince them and he came on board. Ev was Biz's direct manager and they built a strong friendship. As a manager, Ev trusted people with confidential information straight away, and Biz appreciated this. It gave him confidence and pride in his job. It didn't take long for Ev, Biz, Jason and the rest of the Blogger team to feel quite uncomfortable at Google. It had a cutthroat business culture and they were used to working in less of a corporate environment. The Blogger team had been put into a windowless conference room that was close to the bathrooms that they called Drano. The other programmers came mostly from prestigious backgrounds and would brag about their degrees during lunch, and they really didn't understand blogging. The Blogger team ate together and sat in this little corner of the cafeteria and felt like the unpopular kids at high school. Ev realized that Google acquiring Blogger was more so they could place ads next to people's blogs as opposed to their wider vision of push button publishing for the people. In October 2004, Ev sold off all his Google stock and left Google with a goal of never returning to a company like it. At this point in 2004, Noah was inspired by Blogger and his voice message to MP3 product had slightly changed to AudBlog. AudBlog enabled audio posts to people's blogs from any phone, anytime, anywhere. It was essentially a pirate radio project, and he was attempting to subvert government rules and regulations that allowed anyone to have a pirate station. He spoke to Ev about turning AudBlog into more of a startup and asked Ev if he would invest in him so they could kickstart the idea. Noah and Ev's friendship lasted 2 years and he did need something to move on to after Google. Ev said he's happy to invest in him but was worried that a business relationship would affect their friendship. Noah reassured him and said of course they could still make it work and remain as friends. Ev invested money and they changed the name from AudBlog to Odeo. Odeo turned from hosting voice messages as MP3s to a podcasting platform. Noah started looking to hire freelancers by putting posters up, and one email stood out to him from a guy called Evan Henshaw Plath, also known as Rabble, so he met him for an interview. Rabble and his wife were hacktivists. They just finished helping protesters in the 2004 presidential elections. They hired Rabble, who wrote backend code, as well as Gabba, Rabble's wife, to build the desktop version, and Ray McClure was hired to work on the tools for the website. In 2005, back at Google, Biz got a new boss and was miserable. They didn't treat him with the same respect as Ev did. His biggest consideration was giving up $2 million million in unvested stock options. He told his wife Livia, "We didn't move out to California so I could work at Google. We moved out so I could work with Ev." Eventually, they made the decision that he would leave Google. After Google and the investment, Ev started to enjoy the fruit of his previous hard work. He was 32, acting semi-retired, and he wasn't that passionate about audio, at least not as much as he was about Blogger. He began taking Italian cooking classes, exploring museums, bought a house, a fast car, and went on luxurious holidays with his new girlfriend Sarah, who he had met at a Google office party. Noah and the team were working across different coffee shops, and every once in a while Ev would pop in and check on them and ask for an update. Eventually, Audio temporarily moved to Noah's apartment, which caused friction with him and his wife Erin. Later that year, Noah approached Ev for a further $200,000 investment because they were running out of resources. Ev agreed under the condition that he would become CEO. He also agreed that he'd continue paying rent in his old apartment so they could use that as an office. Noah really didn't want to give up the role of the CEO, but he didn't really have much choice. Also in 2005, they hired an engineer called Blaine Cook, as well as a freelance web designer Jack Dorsey, who was living in a tiny apartment and had recently been turned down for a job at a shoe shop called Camper. Jack was sat in Cafe Centro off South Park one day and saw Ev walked in. Ev didn't notice him, but Jack was watching his every move. Jack was too shy to approach him, but he took this as a sign to email him. He found Ev's email online, updated his CV, and redesigned it with red and black writing, split it into 3 sections: Jack, Life, and Love. He messaged him saying he just saw him at the cafe and was wondering if he was hiring, as well as attaching his CV to the message. After a few back and forth emails, Jack was told to come in for an interview, and he was hired almost immediately. He had the hacker mentality, was a university dropout, loved programming, and had a great work ethic. He fit perfectly into the audio culture. They eventually raised money from other venture capitalists, including Charles River Ventures and about a dozen other individuals. It was around $5 million in total, and they had 14 people working on the team full-time. Audio moved out of Ev's old apartment in Mission to a larger space a few blocks from the park off 3rd Street. Now on to Twitter's inception. So in July 2005, Audio had a product, but there was one problem. In June 2005, Apple had announced that iTunes would be including a podcasting platform into every iPod, and they were crushed. Ev contemplated shutting down the company, but Noah thought it would be good to see what the other employees could come up with. If everyone could brainstorm, maybe they could come up with something else. They started holding official company hackathons where employees spent the day coming up with new ideas. The team was also very social. They would go out after work, watch live music, go on bike rides around the city, and drink into the late night, usually talking about technology. Noah and Jack hit it off and soon built a really good friendship. One night in February 2006, Noah and Jack were coming back from a night out. It was around 2 a.m. and Noah was dropping Jack off to his house. It was raining outside. Jack said, "I think I'm going to leave Twitter and become a fashion designer." He said he wanted to sail around the world, and Noah was really surprised, so he asked him to tell him what he's interested in. Jack started talking about a platform where people could share their current status or broadcast simple details like going into the park or going to bed. Status was popular at that time with companies like Facebook or Foursquare, as well as Bourbon app, which later became Instagram. Also, people were posting away messages on AOL Messenger for nearly 10 years at that point, and on live blogging services, people would send away messages when they weren't active or an update of what they were doing. Noah was trying to think about what Jack found so compelling about the idea, so he encouraged him to explain more. At the same time, the audio team was looking at group models where people would talk with friends through audio clips. There were also a few other popular startups that were doing the same thing, particularly one called Dodgeball. Dodgeball let people use their mobile phones to share their current locations with a note attached. It immediately clicked for Noah, and he started thinking of it as some sort of ad hoc group mechanism with non-real-time status updates, all based on mobile phones. Noah was also really stressed at that point. He was going through a divorce and felt kind of lonely sometimes, so he thought this could be a unique way of connecting people together. They were sat on Mission Street, and Noah said to Jack, "I do see how this could really come together." The next morning, on the 27th of February 2006, Jack and Noah went to a conference room to explain the idea to Biz and Ev. They explained that it would be a system where you could send a text to the company number 40404. It would be broadcast to all your friends via text. They would receive an SMS of what you wrote, and you could add more friends via text message. Users could also post and view messages on the website, which was different to their competitors. Ev was skeptical about its potential, but Noah was really pushing it, so he told Noah that he could be in charge of it and they could start working on it. They put a team together, mostly made up of Noah, Jack, and a contractor from Germany called Florian Weber. Biz was kind of involved, at least more than Ev. Noah wrote guidelines and a feature list about how the site would work. Biz explored designs, and Jack and Florian started coding. Now on to the product development. They started thinking about names, and Ev jokingly suggested Friendstalker, but they ruled that out for being too creepy. Noah became obsessive. Late one afternoon, he was alone in his apartment and reached out to his phone to put it on silent, and this caused it to vibrate. So then he started thinking of the name Vibrate. That led him to the name Twitch. He opened the dictionary and continued looking through the T section. He came across Twitter and read the definition. The light chirping sound made by certain words. A similar sound, especially light, tremulous speech or laughter, agitation or excitement, flutter. This was the one. He told the team and they liked it too. At first it was called Twitter, TWTTR. It was a popular trend to remove the vowels of company names, sometimes in order to get a domain name, just like Flickr. About 6 months after Twitter launched though, the domain name twitter.com became available and they changed it to that. On the last hackathon in March 2006, Jack built a prototype for Twitter. After looking over all the employee projects, Ev wrote in an email to Noah and the other execs, "In terms of our new projects, I feel most strongly about Twitter. We could have a lot more discussion and I may change my mind, but I think I just need to make a call at this point and my gut is pulling me to Twitter." Jack was a junior employee, so he wasn't included in this email or in these discussions. Since Twitter was designed as an SMS-based platform, there was a character limit that mobile carriers imposed. As it grew to a web platform, this 140-word character limit remained as part of its brand. Noah spent a lot of time building the mechanism that would facilitate its growth. Features such as police or fire departments giving updates on the city was something built out in the very beginning. In March 2006, they did a soft launch with the prototype, and this was when Jack posted the first ever tweet, followed quickly by Biz and Noah. Odeo employees became obsessed with Twitter and racked up monthly bills totaling hundreds of dollars. Noah said early on, mobile carriers told him they'd never seen so much SMS activity than they did with Twitter, and they were doing thousands of different applications at the time. Later in 2006, the team had a board meeting for Odeo, investors and executives included. They presented the idea of Twitter and they didn't really get it. They just thought, what's the point of this? And thought it was a bit of a waste of time. In July 2006, Twitter launched to the public. TechCrunch covered it and this was their first big piece of publicity. The tech community also didn't seem to understand why Odeo, the podcasting platform, was dabbling into something so weird, but the team were excited. At one point, the entire early Twitter service was running on Noah's laptop, an IBM ThinkPad using a Verizon wireless card. Now on to the betrayal. A power struggle started forming between Ev and Noah. Their personalities were really starting to clash and everyone was noticing it. Noah was very protective of Twitter and was described as the spiritual leader by the team. He was also distracted by his divorce at the time, which meant he was growing increasingly anxious and edgy. One time, a junior employee let a well-known entrepreneur join the app by mistake, and Noah got really mad in front of everyone. He said, "This is our enemy. We need a warm app. They're gonna attack us." Also at one point, Noah wanted to split Twitter into a separate company from Odeo. Odeo was a sinking ship and he really didn't want Twitter to drown with it. He reportedly said to Ev, "I should be running this company, not you. You don't know what you're doing." At this point, Noah and Jack were very close. Noah confessed to Jack saying he feels nervous around Ev because he feels that Ev might want him out because of the increasing tension in the team. Jack told him not to worry about it and things would work out. On Wednesday the 26th of July 2006, Ev spoke to the Odeo board and shortly after asked Noah to join him for a walk at South Park. Ev gave Noah an ultimatum, either 6 months severance and 6 months vesting of Odeo stock, or he would be publicly fired. This was literally Noah's worst nightmare. Ev told him this was his idea alone and no one else's. Later that night, Noah was really deflated. He met up with Jack later on and they stayed out drinking until the late night. Noah confided in Jack and told him that he had been fired and he was really sad about the situation. Jack acted dumbfounded and blamed Evan, and shortly after they hugged each other goodbye and went home. Now the plot twist is that it was actually Jack that wanted Noah out of Twitter and Noah had no idea. Jack met up with Ev before and threatened to quit if Noah wasn't fired. The exact reason for this isn't really known, but there have been a lot of speculations. Anyway, 2 weeks later, Noah left Twitter and they renamed the company to Obvious Corporation. Noah expressed how he felt, saying, "I feel betrayed by my friends, by my company, by the people around me I trusted and that I had worked hard to create something with. Afterwards, I was a little shell-shocked, so I spent a lot of time by myself and working on things alone." In August 2006, a small earthquake shook San Francisco. News spread quickly through Twitter. This is when the team realized that Twitter should be an information network, not just a social network. By autumn that year, Twitter had thousands of users. In September 2006, Ev wrote a letter to investors telling them that Odeo was doing really badly and he felt bad about it. He convinced the investors that to prevent losses, they should sell all their stock back to him. Part of the letter said, "By the way, Twitter, which you may have read about, is one of the pieces of value that I see in Odeo, but it's much too early to tell what's there. Almost 2 months after launch, Twitter has less than 5,000 registered users. I will continue to invest in Twitter, but it's hard to say it justifies the venture investment Odeo certainly holds, especially since the investment was for a different market altogether." Investors agreed. They thought Ev was being open and honest, and in October 2006, Ev, Biz, and Jack acquired the majority of assets from the Odeo investors and shareholders, and the company pivoted to Twitter. In hindsight, there's been a lot of mixed emotions about how Ev handled the situation. It's questionable whether he disclosed the full scope of the situation or whether he played Twitter down, but in truth, we probably won't ever know. 5 years later, in 2011, assets of the company that the original Odeo investors sold for nearly $5 million were then worth $5 billion, leaving quite a few angry or upset investors. investors. In March 2007, Twitter went to South by Southwest, which is an interactive event that takes place in Texas, US, and hosts technology, film, media, music festivals, and conferences. This is when Twitter became mainstream. Usage increased from 20,000 tweets per day to 60,000 tweets per day. The team put two 60-inch plasma screens in the hallways, which exclusively streamed live tweets along with their names, faces, and information on how to sign up. Everyone loved it. They won the prize for Best Startup in the blog category, and Noah actually attended the event. He filmed it, posted it on his YouTube channel, but wasn't invited to go on stage. From here on, Twitter became the platform to instantly know what's happening. A few months after the conference, Twitter passed 100,000 signups. In April 2007, Twitter became an official company, and Ev chose Jack to become the CEO. In 2007, Yahoo wanted to acquire them, despite the fact that they had no revenue or business model. They had acquired Flickr for almost $40 million. Yahoo offered them $12 million, which was way below what Ev, Biz, and Jack would sell for. They declined. Yahoo said they would build a better competitor, and then Ev, Biz, and Jack went to raise venture capital in order to continue expanding and growing. In June 2007, they raised their first round of funding from a handful of investors, including Fred Wilson, a partner at Union Square Ventures. They raised $5 million at a valuation of $20 million. In August 2007, the hashtag was launched to help organize and group the tweets, and this was started by the user Chris Messina. The @ symbol was also added, followed by someone's username to reference someone in a tweet. In June 2008, when raising money, some investors were confused when they received separate phone calls from Ev and Jack, sometimes moments apart. They raised $15 million led by Spark Capital. The partner, Bijan Sabeh, was also on the board of Tumblr. In October 2008, Jack was fired as CEO and replaced by Ev, and this was because of a lot of things. As soon as Twitter started taking off, Jack started doing flashy interviews in the press and neglected managing Twitter. On top of this, he made a habit of leaving work at 6 p.m. to focus on his hobbies. He took a course at a local fashion school to learn how to make an A-line skirt and eventually jeans, sewing, hot yoga, drawing classes, baseball games, parties, and was managing expenses on his laptop, doing the maths incorrectly. One summer afternoon, Ev asked Jack to meet him. He told him, "You can either be a dressmaker or the CEO of Twitter, but you can't be both." Twitter hadn't really upgraded from its prototype. It experienced many server failures which knocked the site offline for hours, and there was no backup of the database. Ev, Biz, and the board of directors were getting frustrated. At first, investors Bijan, Fred, and others on the board were concerned. Ev and Jack started meeting for weekly dinners to discuss the problems. One night, Jack became defensive and said to Ev, "Do you want to be CEO?" Ev tried to avoid the question, but eventually said, "Yes, I want to be CEO. I have experience running a company, and that's what Twitter needs right now." The board offered Jack a 3-month window to fix the issues, but not much changed before the 3 months were out. Bijan and Fred took Jack to breakfast at the Clift Hotel. They told him that they were replacing him with Ev. They offered stock, a $200,000 severance, and a role as silent chairman, so no one in the industry would know that he's been fired, but he would have no voting rights. After Jack was fired, he became their worst nightmare. He was basically going on a media tour and telling elaborate stories about how Twitter was founded. In dozens of interviews, he completely removed Noah from the story, including that he had come up with the name. He also changed his bio on Twitter to inventor. Shortly after, he started removing Ev and Biz from the story too. His story continued to evolve over the years. He was going abroad to places like Iraq on the company's behalf and attending events like the Time 100 Gala. He started portraying himself similar to Steve Jobs. He adopted a single uniform, white buttoned-up Dior shirt, blue jeans, and a black blazer, and referred to himself as an editor like Steve Jobs did. Ev was getting really frustrated with Jack, that he was basically lying to the press and making it seem like Twitter was all him. Biz reportedly told Ev in private, "Jack's gone rogue." Ev confronted Jack about his claims of inventing Twitter and said, "No, you didn't invent Twitter. I didn't invent Twitter either. Neither did Biz. People don't invent things on the internet. They simply expand on an idea that already exists." At the time that Twitter was transitioning from Jack to Ev as CEO, Facebook was thinking of buying Twitter. Jack was interested, but Ev was not interested. The day after Jack was fired, he called Mark Zuckerberg and told him what happened. Mark was concerned on whether there was anything to prevent the firing in order to save the deal, but Jack told him that there wasn't. At this point, instead of trying to buy Twitter, Mark started thinking of ways to hire Jack. Jack met with Chris Cox, who ran Facebook's product division at Phil's Coffee in San Francisco. He told him that they didn't have a specific role in mind, but Mark said he can join and worry about the position later. Jack wanted revenge, but considered how it might look if he were to join Facebook without a specific role. It might look like it was a step down. So he said to Mark, "Let's keep this conversation open and he'll think about it, and if they find a specific role for him, they could talk about it then." Other companies were also interested in buying them. Al Gore pitched to Ev and Biz one night over wine and tequila at his St. Regis suite in San Francisco, and Steve Ballmer, the chief executive of Microsoft, approached Ev during a private dinner at Bill Gates' house. Ev and Biz had estimated that the company was now worth around $500 million, and so they decided that they didn't want to sell and they wanted to keep it as an independent company. With Ev as CEO, the number of signups, visitors, and every other Twitter-related metric continued to double, triple, and quadruple. Ev had considered completely removing Jack from his role as the silent chairman, but he was worried about what he might do if he did this. At this point, Jack started working on a mobile payments company called Square. On to some more of Twitter's growth. In May 2008, the website became really well known for going offline for hours. Viz found an image online created by the Australian artist Yeyang Liu, which became the iconic fail whale. The team used it to symbolize that they acknowledge there's a problem and they're working on it. On the 15th of January 2009, a US Airways flight crashed on the Hudson River in New York City, and a photo posted on Twitter broke the news before the traditional media. This was a really big step for Twitter. It was increasingly being used as a tool for amateur journalists. In January 2009, celebrities like Ashton Kutcher joined, and soon came Justin Bieber, Queen Rania of Jordan, and eventually world leaders like President Hugo Chavez of Venezuela and the Dalai Lama. In February 2009, Twitter's active users were growing by 900% year on year, and they had 30 full-time employees. They were getting ready to raise their Series C funding, and Ev invited the VC Peter Fenton from Benchmark Capital, who desperately wanted to join the board of Twitter. Before becoming an investor, Peter thought that Jack had an active day-to-day role in the operations of Twitter, but he later found out that he didn't, and he sensed some tension between Jack and Ev in one of the first few board meetings that he attended. Peter invited Jack to meet him, and here Jack told him that Ev pushed Jack out over power and control and started complaining about it a lot. Peter told him that he won't rest until Jack is back. Peter also started getting frustrated that Ev wasn't able to manage Twitter's rapid growth. They needed a COO and a CTO, and he was just very slow at making decisions. He suggested bringing in a couple of advisors: Bill Campbell, the former CEO of Intuit and head coach of the Columbia University football team, who had mentored Steve Jobs, as well as Google's Eric Schmidt and many others. On Ev's first meeting with Bill, Bill told him that the worst thing he could do is hire his friends, because Ev had a habit of doing this. He told him that friendship and business don't mix. Ev and Bill shook hands, and they agreed to meet each other once a week from then on. Ev ignored Bill's advice. He hired his sister to stock the kitchens at Twitter, his wife Sarah to design the new offices, and he employed numerous friends from Google. Between 2009 and 2010, a lot happened, but to sum it up, Ev and Biz met up with Al Gore to discuss how his TV network could show tweets in real time. Ashton Kutcher became the first to hit 1 million followers in a race with CNN. Ev appeared on Oprah, which led to record signups of Twitter. Iranian protesters used Twitter to stage post-election demonstrations. Dick Costolo, a friend of Ev who worked at Google, a former improv comedian who recently sold his startup for $100 million, is brought on board as COO to help Twitter's profitability. Twitter changes its title from "What's your status" to "What's happening," just like Ev wanted and Noah originally imagined. Twitter made some revenue for the first time through a deal with Google and Microsoft. They experimented with promoted tweets for income, and retweets were introduced by popular demand. By this point, investors and board members started holding secret meetings with Jack with a plan to remove Ev from the company. Anyway, Ev was focused on completely redesigning Twitter and was neglecting some of his responsibilities as CEO. He was still very slow at making decisions, and this was frustrating a lot of his colleagues. In September 2010, Bill Campbell went to Ev's office and told him he's going to have a tough conversation with him. He said to him that the board wanted him to step up to the chairman role. He told him that Dick would be replacing him in the interim as CEO. Ev was shocked. He called Bijan the investor, and Bijan was very apologetic. He told him that they wanted to keep him on a product advisory role. About 2 weeks later, on the 4th of October 2010, the news was about to be announced publicly. Ev was in the office that morning, and just as he was about to address the company publicly, he reportedly told the woman in his office to get out because he wanted to throw up. The Twitter PR team were reviewing the blog post that was going to be publicized as soon as Ev finished addressing the company, telling them that he's stepping down on his own volition and Dick would be taking over. At this point, Twitter had 165 million registered users, and about 90 million tweets were being sent out per day. After Ev left, Dick removed the infrastructure problems that Twitter was constantly experiencing, expanded the team, and started relentlessly exploring ways to make money and make the company profitable. In March 2011, Jack rejoined the company as executive chairman with a focus on product development, and around the same time, Ev emailed colleagues to tell them he was leaving his day-to-day role at Twitter. Biz followed him and stepped down as the creative director in June 2011. In September 2011, 1 billion tweets were being sent out each week on Twitter. In June 2012, they modified their logo, and in October 2012, they acquired Vine for $30 million. Vine allowed people to take 6-second clips capturing their daily lives and was the go-to spot for short-term videos. They released it as a standalone app in January 2013. The most tweeted moment in history happened on the 2nd of August 2013 during a Japanese television airing of Studio Ghibli film Castle in the Sky. There was a global peak of 143,199 tweets in 1 second, beating the previous record of 33,388. In September 2013, Twitter filed to become a public company and announced this in a tweet. In November 2013, its initial public offering funding, raised $1.8 billion, giving it a market value of $31 billion. This IPO made Ev and Jack instant billionaires and a lot of other people millionaires or multimillionaires. Since the IPO, they've done a lot, including launching mobile apps. They acquired Periscope, the live video streaming startup. They discontinued Vine. They've started making a profit. They expanded the character count from 140 to 280 words and has become an extremely popular tool for world leaders to communicate on. In 2015, Dick Costolo stepped down as CEO but remained on the board, and Jack took over and he is still the CEO now. A few other statistics include in 2020, Twitter had 5,500 employees and made $3.72 billion in revenue. In the first quarter of 2019, they had 330 million monthly users and a total of 1.3 billion accounts created. 22% of Americans use Twitter, and of those, 10% account for 80% of the tweets. 83% of world leaders are on Twitter, and journalists make 24.6% of verified accounts. As of August 2021, the most followed people on Twitter are Barack Obama, Justin Bieber, Katy Perry, Rihanna, and Cristiano Ronaldo. The last thing I'm going to touch on is where the founders are now, starting with Evan Williams. In 2009, Evan was listed under the Times 100 most influential people in the world. In October 2010, a New York Times article came out where Evan said, "All successful business people make enemies along the way. He is a very interesting character, and former investors and employees describe him as extremely calculating." On the 25th of September 2012, Ev created the publishing platform Medium, which was open to the public in 2013, and he is currently the CEO of Medium. Regardless of his character, Ev has undoubtedly had a massive impact on the world of social networks today, having co-founded 3 of the largest internet platforms of their kind in Blogger, Twitter, and Medium. On the 6th of April 2017, an article announced that Ev was selling off 30% of his Twitter stock for personal reasons. In February 2019, he stepped down from his role as a board member of Twitter and sold his shares, saying, "I will continue rooting for the time as I work on other projects." Jack tweeted, "I appreciate you, Ev. You're the reason I joined Odeo in the first place." Ev's a vegetarian and lives with his wife Sarah in San Francisco with their 2 children, and his net worth as of 2021 is reportedly $2.4 billion. Next, in terms of Christopher or Biz, in 2012, Biz co-founded a search engine driven by visual imagery and discovery where users post questions that are answered by others. The social network was called Jelly, and he built it with Ben Finkel. Ben was the co-founder of Flutter, which is a social Q&A site that Twitter acquired in 2010. Jelly was acquired by Pinterest in 2017 for an undisclosed amount. In May 2016, Biz announced that he was returning to Twitter. Biz is an angel investor and advisor to a lot of companies. He's written 3 books and lives in Marin County, California with his wife Livia and their son Jacob. Him and his wife founded and operate the Biz and Livia Stone Foundation, which supports education and conservation in California. Biz reportedly has a net worth of $250 million and holds the patent for inventing Twitter with Jack. He has also won a few awards and honors such as Inc. Magazine's Entrepreneur of the Decade, Times 100 Most Influential People in the World, GQ Nerd of the Year with Ev, and the Economist Innovation Award. As for Jack, as well as being the main face of Twitter, as mentioned earlier, in 2009 he co-founded and became the CEO of Square, which is a mobile payments company. He currently is the CEO of both Square and Twitter and has been since 2015. In 2012, the Wall Street Journal gave him the Innovator of the Year award for technology, and in December 2013 he became a member of the Disney Company's board of directors. In 2009, Jack planned on going to Africa for up to 6 months in 2020, but because of the pandemic this kind of delayed things. Jack reportedly has a net worth of $13.9 billion and lives in his $10 million seaside house on El Camino del Mar in the exclusive San Francisco neighborhood with a view of the Golden Gate Bridge. He's become quite philanthropic over the years, including donating $1 billion to fund COVID efforts, which was 28% of his net worth in April 2020. Finally, I'm going to touch on Noah Glass, who has been betrayed the most out of everyone in this story. After being ousted from Twitter, Noah fell into depression and cut off all of his friends. In 2011, when asked how he feels when hearing interviews like the one they had in 2011 with Howard Stern and Jack changed the story of Twitter's founding, Noah responded, "I try not to listen. Honestly, for the past few years, I try not to listen. I moved to Los Angeles 2 years ago just to get away from it, to get away from the noise, because I couldn't move on. There was a time I approached them. I approached Jack and Ev and said, I want to be included in this story. I want some credit. I looked at emails and some documentation and said, these things should be acknowledged. I should be acknowledged as a co-creator. I have mixed emotions, of course." In 2011, Ev tweeted and gave some credit to Noah. He said, "It's true that Noah never got enough credit for his early role at Twitter. Also, he came up with the name, which was brilliant. After spending some time in LA working on something completely different, and he says he spent a lot of time working on things on his own. He moved back to San Francisco to get back into collaboration and has been working on projects which could flesh out into something big if fleshed out. According to Business Insider, who wrote an article about it in 2013, he was living in an apartment that was built as an earthquake shack and that he shares with his girlfriend, his infant daughter, and his dog, Iwi. A few days before the Twitter IPO, Noah bumped into Ev. It was reported that after a moment of initial shock, the two men in their early 40s at the time chatted amiably, recalling how they had once been next door neighbors, then extremely close friends, then co-founders, all just a few blocks away. They politely agreed that they should meet up for a coffee and went their separate ways. When asked about equity, Noah said he received a very small amount right at the beginning. The bio of his Twitter account reads, "I started this," and his Twitter hasn't been updated since September 2013. His last tweet said, "I wish the Twitter team the best of luck and trust that they will be successful in continuing to develop this important communication tool." He has a Flickr page with a few photos, a YouTube channel that hasn't been updated since 2008, and a blog that hasn't been updated since 2009. Noah says that Florian Weber, the contractor and early engineer that worked on Twitter right at the beginning, doesn't get enough credit for his work either. He said some people have gotten credit, some people haven't. The reality is it was a group effort. So that was it, the story of Twitter. I honestly could have gone on for ages if I included every bit of detail that I read about and researched about, but it would be really interesting to hear what you guys' opinion about it is. I think Nick Bilton puts it really well by describing it as a story of money, friendship, power, and betrayal, especially with Noah and how things worked out. Obviously, we don't know if there's anything else that has happened behind the scenes, but it is a very interesting story and I don't think a lot of people know about the details of it. Please feel free to comment and like and subscribe and let me know if there's any other story that you would like me to cover or talk about. Thank you very much for watching and I will see you in the next video.